He thought it was just a storm, but what he'd really ridden into was the devil's parlor, and the two women watching him from the window. They'd been waiting for someone just like him all night. Royce Barrett didn't know this, of course. To him, the rain was just rain, a cold, hammering force that beat against his worn leather coat and turned the world into a gray blur. His horse, a sturdy beast named Cinder, plodded forward, its head low against the wind. Every muscle in Royce's body was a knot of pain, a screaming testament to 3 straight days of hard riding. All he wanted was a hot meal and a dry bed, just one night of peace before he pushed on north. Through the sheeting rain, a faint yellow light flickered like a lone star in a black ocean. It was a boarding house, weathered and isolated, with a sign hanging crooked above the porch. In faded letters it read, "Magnolia's Rest." A place of peace, he thought. A place to get out of this God-forsaken weather. As he drew closer, he could see silhouettes in the window. 2 figures. They seemed to be watching him, their shapes frozen against the warm glow of the lamp inside. When he pulled Cinder to a stop, the figures moved, disappearing from the window. He felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck, the kind of feeling that warns a man when he's being watched too closely. But he was too tired, too cold, too hungry to listen to it. He just wanted to get inside. Thunder cracked open the sky, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath his boots. He dismounted, his feet sinking into the thick, sucking mud. The job waiting for him in Copper Ridge felt a million miles away. It was honest work, breaking horses on a big cattle ranch. Nothing glamorous, but it would keep him fed through the winter, and that was all a man like him could ask for. He had a little money in his saddlebags, enough to get him there, enough to pay for a room for the night. He just had to hope this place was as welcoming as its name suggested. He started towards the porch, his hand ready to knock on the heavy wooden door. But before his knuckles could even touch the wood, the door swung open. A woman stood there, framed by the warm light from inside. She was in her 40s, maybe older, with dark hair pulled back in a tight, neat bun. She wore a simple blue dress, faded from countless washings but clean. Her smile was the first thing he noticed. It was wide and welcoming, but there was something in her eyes, a strange flicker of, what was it? Excitement. It was an odd look for someone greeting a half-drowned stranger on a night like this. It made him hesitate for just a fraction of a second. "Well now," she said, her voice smooth and syrupy sweet. "Aren't you a sight for sore eyes? Looks like the storm blew something interesting our way for once." She stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "I'm Magnolia, but everyone just calls me Maggie. Come on in out of that weather before you catch your death." The inside of the house was simple but clean. A small parlor sat to one side, dominated by a large stone fireplace, where a healthy fire crackled and spat, throwing dancing shadows across the room. A narrow staircase led up to the second floor. By the fire, a younger woman sat in a rocking chair, her head bent over some needlework in her lap. She had blonde hair, so pale it was almost white, and when she looked up as he entered, her blue eyes were wide. She looked nervous, like a deer that had heard a twig snap in the woods. "This here's Bertie," Maggie said, gesturing with her hand toward the younger woman. "She helps me run the place. Lord knows I couldn't do it all myself." Maggie's eyes lingered on Royce, taking in his soaked coat, his tired face, his worn gun belt. "We don't get many travelers through these parts," she added, her smile never wavering. "Especially not when the weather turns mean like this." Royce took off his hat, letting the rainwater drip onto the wooden floorboards. He felt a powerful sense of unease settle in his gut. Something was wrong here. Their welcome felt too practiced, their smiles too bright. It was like they were actors on a stage, playing the part of friendly hosts. But the warmth from the fireplace was a powerful lure, pulling him in, promising to chase the cold from his bones. He was tired, so tired. His judgment was clouded by exhaustion. He decided to ignore the warning bells ringing in his head. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "Name's Royce Barrett. I'd be grateful for a room and a hot meal. I can pay." As he said his name, Bertie's needlework slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. She gasped and bent quickly to retrieve it, her face hidden from view. When she straightened up again, her skin was even paler than before, almost translucent in the firelight. Royce didn't think much of it. She just seemed like a jumpy girl. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was the way her terrified eyes darted toward a closed door at the back of the house. And he didn't notice that Maggie's wide, welcoming smile never ever reached her cold, watchful eyes. He was just a tired traveler after all. And this was just a boarding house. What could possibly go wrong? The stew was wrong. It was the first thing he noticed after the warmth. Maggie bustled around her small, tidy kitchen, the picture of hospitality. She ladled a thick brown stew into a chipped ceramic bowl, the smell of beef and vegetables filling the air. But underneath that savory aroma, there was something else, a bitter, almost medicinal scent that he couldn't quite place. It was faint, almost hidden, but it was there. His stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing rumble that echoed in the quiet room. He hadn't eaten a real meal since dawn, and the promise of food, any food, was enough to make him push his suspicions aside. He was just being paranoid. The road did that to a man. "You look like you've been riding for a week straight," Maggie observed, her voice full of fake sympathy. She set the bowl down in front of him at the small wooden table. "Where are you headed in such a hurry, if you don't mind an old woman's curiosity?" Royce picked up the heavy spoon, his hand trembling slightly from a combination of cold and exhaustion. "Copper Ridge," he said, keeping his answer short. "Got a job waiting for me there." He dipped the spoon into the stew and brought it to his lips. The moment it touched his tongue, he winced. The salt. It was overwhelming, so salty it was almost inedible. But he was starving, and complaining would be rude. He forced himself to swallow the first bite, the thick liquid leaving a strange, metallic aftertaste in his mouth. "Beggars can't be choosers," he told himself, especially not in a storm like this. Across the room, Bertie had returned to her rocking chair and her needlework. But she wasn't working. Her hands were still, her fingers fumbling with the thread. She kept stealing quick, nervous glances at him, her wide blue eyes full of a fear he couldn't understand. Every time he looked in her direction, she would quickly look down at her lap, her hands starting to move again in a frantic, clumsy rhythm. Suddenly, the needle slipped, pricking her finger. A small gasp escaped her lips, and a single drop of bright red blood welled up on her fingertip. "Careful there, Bertie," Maggie said, her voice suddenly sharp and cold, all traces of her earlier warmth gone. The change in tone was so abrupt it startled Royce. "You can't afford to get blood on Mrs. Henderson's tablecloth. You know how particular she is." The name Mrs. Henderson meant nothing to Royce, but he saw the way Bertie flinched at the sound of it, a full-body recoil as if she'd been struck. She pressed her bleeding finger to her lips, her eyes darting toward Maggie with a look of pure terror. She nodded quickly, a silent, subservient gesture, and returned to her sewing with a renewed, desperate focus. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind howled like a hungry wolf around the corners of the house, rattling the window panes in their frames. The oil lamps on the tables flickered, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. The isolation of this place was becoming more and more apparent with each passing minute. They were miles from anywhere. No one would be traveling these roads tonight. No one would hear them if they screamed. "This is mighty kind of you, lady," Royce said, forcing another spoonful of the salty stew down his throat. He needed to keep things normal, to pretend he didn't notice the strange currents running through this house. Not many folks would open their doors to a stranger on a night like this. Maggie let out a laugh, but it was a high, forced sound, brittle as glass. "Oh, we believe in hospitality out here in the wilderness," she said, moving to the window and peering out into the black, churning darkness. "A traveler is always welcome at Magnolia's Rest." She paused, her back to him. "Besides," she added, her voice dropping a little, "it gets lonely with just the two of us. It's nice to have some company for a change." There was something in her voice, an undercurrent of a dark anticipation, that sent a shiver down Royce's spine. It was the voice of a predator waiting for its trap to spring. He found himself studying her more carefully as he ate. Her simple dress was well maintained, her hands were soft and pale. These were not the rough, work-worn hands of a woman who ran a remote boarding house by herself. These were the hands of someone who didn't do much manual labor at all. The stew was settling in his stomach now, a heavy leaden weight. A wave of drowsiness washed over him, so powerful and sudden it was like being hit by a physical force. The warmth of the fire, the long days on the trail, it was all catching up to him. He blinked hard, trying to shake off the thick, syrupy fatigue that was creeping into his limbs, fogging his thoughts. He felt drunk, but he hadn't had a drop of alcohol. "Your room is upstairs," Maggie said, turning from the window. She was smiling again, but now her smile looked predatory, like a wolf baring its teeth. He hadn't even asked about his room yet. "Second door on the right. There's clean sheets on the bed and a soft mattress. I promise you," she said, her eyes gleaming in the lamplight, "you'll sleep like the dead." At the phrase, "like the dead," Bertie's needle slipped from her fingers again. This time she didn't just gasp. A small, choked sob escaped her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Royce pushed his chair back from the table, his movements slow and clumsy. His legs felt strangely unsteady beneath him, as if they were made of cotton. As he stood up, the room seemed to tilt and sway. He knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that sleep was the absolute last thing he should be thinking about right now. Something was terribly wrong, and he had a feeling he'd just eaten his last supper. The stairs were a mountain. Royce gripped the wooden banister, his knuckles white, as he hauled himself up, one slow, deliberate step at a time. Each step required more effort than the last. The old wooden stairs creaked and groaned under his weight, the sound echoing in the strangely silent house. He had to pause halfway up, leaning against the wall to steady himself as the world spun around him. This wasn't just trail fatigue. This was something else, something sinister. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, the warm light from the lamps smearing into long, distorted streaks. His thoughts felt thick and slow, like they were wading through molasses. He'd been drugged before. A couple of opportunistic claim jumpers in Colorado had tried the same trick a few years back, hoping to get their hands on his horse and his pay. This felt terrifyingly similar, but stronger, much stronger. The drug was working with a frightening speed, a poison spreading through his veins, shutting down his body piece by piece. Behind him, down in the parlor, he could hear Maggie and Bertie whispering. Their voices were urgent, hushed tones, too low for him to make out the actual words, but the intent was clear. It was the sound of vultures circling, waiting for their prey to finally fall. He had to keep moving, had to get to the room, had to find a way to fight this. The second door on the right. He pushed it open and staggered inside. It was a small, simple room, just as Maggie had described. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single window that rattled and shook with each new gust of wind. But there was something wrong with this room, too. It was clean. Too clean. For a boarding house that Maggie claimed rarely saw visitors, this room was immaculate. The floor was freshly swept, with no dust in the corners. The bed was made with crisp, tight corners, the quilt perfectly smooth. The wash basin on the stand gleamed in the lamplight, polished to a high shine. This wasn't a room that had been sitting empty, gathering dust. This was a room that had been recently and thoroughly scrubbed. Royce dropped his heavy saddlebags on the floor with a thud and sank onto the edge of the bed. His head was spinning violently now, and a wave of nausea washed over him, hot and acidic. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to fight it off, trying to force his mind to work through the chemical fog. Whatever they had put in that stew, it was potent. They expected him to be unconscious by now, a dead weight for them to handle. Fighting through the growing darkness in his mind, he forced himself to stand up. He had to search the room. There had to be a clue, something that would tell him what was really going on in this house. He swayed on his feet, using the bedpost to steady himself as he scanned the small space. And that's when he saw it. Underneath the bed, almost completely hidden in the deep shadows, was a faint gleam of reflected light, the glint of polished metal. He dropped to one knee, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He reached under the dusty bed frame, his fingers brushing against something cold and hard. Cold steel. He pulled it out. It was a knife, but not just any knife. It was a beautiful, expensive-looking blade with a handle carved from bone. The carving on the grip was distinctive, a swirling pattern of vines and leaves. Royce's blood ran cold. He had seen this knife before. 3 weeks ago, in a saloon in Silver Creek, he had shared a drink with a man who carried this exact knife on his belt. He was a cattle buyer, a friendly, talkative fellow named Morrison. He'd been heading south carrying a significant amount of cash to close a deal on a large herd. Morrison had proudly shown off the knife, a gift from his wife. He had been so proud of it. Morrison had never made it to his destination. He had vanished without a trace somewhere on this very road. A cold, hard dread settled deep in Royce's gut. This wasn't just a robbery, this was a tomb. Panic gave him a jolt of adrenaline, clearing his head for a moment. He began to search the rest of the room with a new, frantic energy. He found more items, all hastily shoved out of sight. Behind the washstand, he found a silver pocket watch with the initials JP engraved on the back. Tucked under the loose floorboard beneath the rug was a pair of expensive leather gloves, the kind a wealthy merchant would wear. And inside the empty water pitcher was a small leather pouch that still held a few gleaming gold coins. These were the personal effects of other travelers. Travelers who had stopped for a rest at Magnolia's. Travelers who had eaten the salty stew. Travelers who had stayed in this very room and had never ever left. The quiet whispering from downstairs had stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, a sound that made the hair on Royce's arms stand on end. The sound of heavy boots on the front porch. Multiple sets of them. They were approaching the house through the storm, their steps heavy and purposeful. The real predators had arrived. Royce finally understood. Maggie and Bertie weren't just simple thieves. They were the bait. They lured travelers in, drugged them, and then handed them over to their accomplices. The men who would handle the final, brutal details. His hands were shaking, not just from the drug, but from a primal fear. He fumbled for his gun, his fingers feeling like clumsy, useless sausages. The room was spinning faster and faster now, the walls seeming to close in on him. He could barely keep his eyes focused. Through the rattling window, he caught a glimpse of lantern light moving around the side of the building, bobbing in the darkness. They were surrounding the house. Just then the front door creaked open downstairs. Unfamiliar male voices joined the women's, their low rumbles carrying up the staircase. Royce was trapped in a room that had become a graveyard, with a poison in his veins and killers closing in. His time was running out faster than his fading consciousness could handle. The voices from downstairs were a low, ugly murmur, drifting up through the warped floorboards. Royce pressed his ear to the wood, straining to hear, fighting against the thick, suffocating blanket the drug was throwing over his mind. The old planks were thin, and the sound carried with a chilling clarity. What he heard turned his blood to ice water. "He's a big one," came a gravelly voice, rough and deep. "Gonna be more work than that last fellow, the little drummer." Royce's heart hammered against his ribs. The last fellow. They were talking about this like it was just another chore, like butchering a hog. "I found nearly $200 in his saddlebags," Maggie's voice replied. But her voice was different now. The warm, motherly tone was completely gone, stripped away to reveal something hard and sharp underneath. It was the voice of a businesswoman discussing profits. "Plus whatever he's got on his person. Not a bad haul for a stormy night's work." A different man spoke up, his voice younger, tinged with impatience. "What about the girl? She's getting jumpy again. Saw her nearly stick herself with that needle twice tonight while he was eating." Bertie. They were talking about Bertie. "Bertie knows what happens if she causes problems," Maggie replied, her voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. "She learned her lesson after what happened with that merchant from Tucson. We won't have a repeat of that." The merchant from Tucson. The owner of the expensive leather gloves, no doubt. Royce's vision was getting worse, the room swimming in and out of focus. But a surge of pure, cold adrenaline was cutting through the fog, sharpening his thoughts even as his body failed him. He had to move. He forced himself to crawl, dragging his body across the floor toward his saddlebags with painful, agonizing slowness. Every muscle screamed in protest. His fingers, clumsy and numb, fumbled at the worn leather. He wasn't reaching for the $200 Maggie had found. He was reaching for something she had missed. A hidden compartment he'd painstakingly sewn into the leather, lining himself, a place where he kept his real purpose for traveling these lonely roads. His fingers closed around a small, flat metal object. He pulled it out. In the flickering lamplight, the five-pointed star seemed to drink in the darkness and shine it back out. A badge. United States Marshal. He wasn't a drifter named Royce Barrett. He was Marshal Royce Kane. And he'd been tracking this very operation for 3 long months. He wasn't just a random victim who had stumbled into their web. He had been hunting them. The reports had been trickling in for almost a year. Travelers vanishing along this stretch of road. Morrison, the cattle buyer with the bone-handled knife, had been his last solid lead. Morrison had been carrying more than just cash. He'd been carrying information, a list of suspected safe houses and criminal sympathizers in the territory. This lonely boarding house, Magnolia's Rest, had been at the very top of that list. He had ridden into the spider's web on purpose. He just hadn't expected the spider to bite so fast. Creak. The sound of a heavy footstep on the stairs. Then another. They were coming. Royce managed to get his Colt Peacemaker clear of its holster, the familiar weight of the gun a small comfort in his shaking hand. He could barely grip it. The room was tilting at a dizzying angle, and he had to brace his shoulder against the wall just to stay upright. His plan had been to play the part of a simple traveler, to observe, to gather evidence, but they had been one step ahead of him. Should be out cold by now, the gravelly voice was saying, just outside his door. Maggie's special recipe always works fast. But Royce had a secret advantage. In his years of undercover work, tracking the worst dregs of humanity through the frontier, he'd built up a tolerance to certain sedatives and poisons. It was a grim necessity of the job. The drug was affecting him, yes, but it wasn't knocking him out as quickly or as completely as they expected. It was a slim advantage, a razor's edge, but it was the only one he had. The door handle began to turn, slowly. Through his blurred vision, Royce could see the brass knob rotating with a horrifying slowness. He knew he was too weak to win a straight fight. His coordination was shot, his strength was gone. He had to rely on surprise. He pushed himself into the corner behind the door, making his weakened body as small as possible. Desperation was a powerful motivator. He would only get one shot at this. The door swung open. A large barrel-chested man stepped into the room. He was holding a lantern in one hand and a coiled length of thick rope in the other. Behind him, a second, skinnier figure waited in the hallway, silhouetted against the light from downstairs. They were expecting to find an unconscious victim, a helpless body to be tied and dragged away. They weren't expecting to find an armed and very much aware U.S. Marshal waiting for them. "Where the hell?" the big man started to say, his eyes wide with confusion as he saw the empty bed. That was the only opening Royce needed. He lunged forward with every last ounce of strength he could muster. He didn't fire the gun. A gunshot would bring the whole pack down on him at once. Instead, he used it as a club, bringing the heavy steel barrel down hard on the back of the big man's skull. There was a sickening crack. The man grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor like a sack of grain. The lantern fell from his limp hand, crashing against the dry wooden planks. The glass shattered, oil spilled out in a glistening pool, and in an instant, a small flame from the wick ignited it. A whoosh of fire erupted, spreading across the floorboards with terrifying speed. The second man in the hallway shouted an alarm. "He's awake! Get up here!" Suddenly, the whole house erupted into chaos. Footsteps pounded on the stairs, voices were yelling orders, and the acrid smell of smoke began to fill the air. Royce staggered toward the window, his only escape route. His legs finally gave out from under him, and he collapsed to the floor. As he looked back, he saw the fire spreading, a wall of orange and yellow flame now blocking the doorway. The fire might be his salvation, or it might be his death sentence. And right now, as his consciousness began to fade into black, it was absolutely impossible to tell which. The heat was a living thing, a searing beast that clawed at his skin and choked the air from his lungs. Smoke, thick and black, filled the small room, burning his eyes and throat. Royce crawled on his hands and knees toward the window, his body a dead weight that refused to obey him. The drug was winning its battle, pulling him down into a deep, dark abyss. but the primal fear of being burned alive was a powerful anchor to consciousness. Behind him the fire raged. It was devouring the old dry wood of the house with a hungry roar. He could hear the men shouting in the hallway, their voices a mix of fury and panic. "The whole place is going up!" Someone yelled, his voice tight with alarm. "Get him out of there before we lose everything!" But the fire had become his unlikely guardian. It had created a blazing, impassable barrier between him and his pursuers. The flames had already caught the bedsheets and were climbing the walls with terrifying intensity, the old floral wallpaper peeling and blackening in the heat. Through the swirling smoke, he could see the orange light dancing across the ceiling as the inferno found new fuel in the ancient timber of the house. He reached the wall and used it for support, hauling himself to his feet. He swayed, the room lurching around him like the deck of a ship in a storm. He fumbled with the window latch, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. The simple metal mechanism felt impossibly complex. The glass of the window was already hot to the touch, warmed by the fire spreading through the floor below. He managed to get the latch undone and shoved the window open. A rush of cold, rain-soaked air blasted into the room, a shocking, welcome relief. The fresh air helped to clear some of the fog from his mind, cutting through the drug's haze. He could see the porch roof below him. It was a 12-foot drop onto slick, wet wooden shingles, and then another 10 feet from there to the muddy ground. It was a dangerous jump, but it was better than burning to death. Just as he was about to climb out, he heard voices from below. More men. They were gathering around the building, their dark shapes moving in the flickering firelight. They were waiting for him, anticipating this very escape. They were cutting off his only way out. "He's at the window!" It was Bertie's voice that cut through the night, sharp and clear from somewhere below. "Don't let him get away." Her voice held a note of cold command that surprised him. But as Royce prepared to take his chances and jump, he heard something else. Something that made him pause, his leg halfway over the windowsill. Behind the angry shouting of the men and the crackling roar of the flames, there was another sound. A woman crying. It wasn't Maggie's voice. It was Bertie's. And she wasn't crying out in excitement or anger. These were the racking sobs of genuine, heartbreaking anguish. "Please," she was calling out now, her voice choked and desperate. "I never wanted any of this. They made me do it. They have my sister." The revelation hit Royce like a physical blow, more powerful than any drug. Bertie, the nervous girl with the fumbling hands. She wasn't a willing participant in this network of murder. She was a prisoner. She was being coerced. Suddenly, everything about her made sense. The nervous behavior, the fumbling with her needlework, the way she flinched whenever Maggie spoke sharply to her. The terror in her eyes wasn't just fear of being caught, it was the fear of a hostage. She was as much a victim as the poor souls who had died in this very room. The flames were licking at the doorframe now, the heat becoming unbearable. Royce could see figures moving in the hallway through the smoke, but the fire was keeping them at bay, at least for the moment. He had a choice to make, and he had to make it now. He could escape through the window, save himself, and leave Bertie to whatever terrible fate awaited her at the hands of these monsters. Or he could try to help her, try to save the one person who might be the key to bringing down this entire evil operation. But just as he was weighing his options, a heavy wooden beam from the ceiling, eaten through by the fire, crashed down behind him. It landed right in the doorway, sending up a shower of sparks and completely blocking his way back into the house. Royce realized his choice was being made for him. The window was no longer just an escape route. It was his only chance at survival. And Bertie would have to wait. The porch roof held his weight for exactly 3 seconds. The old rotted shingles, soaked by the relentless rain, groaned in protest and then gave way with a sharp crack. Royce plunged through, a yell ripped from his throat, and he crashed into the thick, cold mud below. He hit the ground hard, his shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. A starburst of white-hot pain shot through his body. But the shock of the fall and the icy rain were like a slap to the face, helping to burn through the last vestiges of the drug's effects. He could think more clearly now, his mind sharp and focused, though his body was still a clumsy, uncooperative mess. Around him, chaos reigned. Men were shouting orders, their voices cutting through the storm. They were running towards his position, their lanterns swinging wildly, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that danced in the night. He rolled, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and took cover behind a large wooden water barrel. He tried to assess the situation. The boarding house was a funeral pyre, fully engulfed in flames that shot from the upstairs windows and licked at the night sky. The roof was beginning to sag, ready to collapse. In the hellish orange glow of the fire, he could see at least 4 men moving around the property, the 2 who had come upstairs plus 2 others who must have been waiting outside for the signal. But where were Maggie and Bertie? Through the confusion and the driving rain, he spotted them near the back of the house by a small dark barn. Maggie was dragging Bertie away from the burning building, her hand clamped around the younger woman's arm like a vice. Bertie was struggling, fighting against her grip with a desperate strength. Even from this distance, Royce could see that Bertie wasn't trying to escape the fire. She was trying to escape Maggie. "Stop fighting me, you little fool!" Maggie's voice, shrill with rage, carried over the noise of the storm and the crackling flames. "We need to get to the horses before this whole place comes down on our heads." Bang! A gunshot rang out. Splinters of wood exploded from the water barrel, inches from Royce's head. One of the men had spotted him. Royce drew his Colt, his hand now steady, and returned fire. His aim was still off, the lingering effects of the drug making his movements jerky. The shot went wide, but it bought him a few precious seconds. He scrambled from behind the barrel and moved to better cover behind a tall, neat pile of firewood. The fire was spreading now, jumping from the main house to the other outbuildings. The small barn and what looked like a storage shed were starting to catch, the flames greedily consuming everything in their path. Whatever evidence of their crimes was stored in this place, years of stolen belongings from countless victims, was turning to ash before his very eyes. Through the smoke and confusion, he heard Bertie scream. It was not a scream of fear, but a scream of pain. He peered around the edge of the woodpile and saw that Maggie had struck her, a vicious backhand blow that had dropped the young woman to her knees in the mud. The older woman was standing over her, shouting something about teaching her a lesson, about knowing her place. That's when Royce finally understood the full scope of what was happening here. This wasn't just a small-time robbery operation. This was a network, organized and ruthless. Maggie was the queen bee, the one in charge. The men were her enforcers, her muscle, and Bertie and her sister were leverage. They were using family to ensure cooperation, a classic and brutally effective tactic. Fighting through his impaired coordination, Royce began to move, circling around the burning building, using the chaos and the thick smoke as cover. He had to get to Bertie. He had to get her away from Maggie before they got her on a horse and disappeared into the night. She was the key. She knew how large this operation was, who else was involved, where her sister was being held. Another gunshot split the night, this one much closer. A man, a dark silhouette against the roaring fire, emerged from the smoke to his left, his rifle raised. Royce didn't hesitate. He fired. His return shot was true this time, hitting the man square in the chest. The man dropped his rifle and crumpled to the ground without a sound. But the exchange had given away his position. He could hear boots running towards him through the mud, men shouting his location to each other. The storm was intensifying, the rain turning into a torrential downpour, making visibility even worse. But the storm was also his ally, masking the sound of his movements as he slipped through the shadows. He reached the corner of the burning house and saw Maggie forcing Bertie toward a group of horses tied up behind the now smoldering storage shed. But what Royce saw next made his blood run cold. There were 7 horses tied there. 7. But he had only seen 4 men, plus Maggie. That meant there were other members of this gang, members who hadn't shown themselves yet, and they were probably moving to surround him even now. He was walking into a trap, and the last man standing wasn't who he expected at all. The adrenaline was afire in his veins now, burning away the last sluggish remnants of the drug. His head was clear, his movements precise. He moved through the smoke and rain like a phantom, the roar of the fire and the howl of the wind concealing his approach. The boarding house was collapsing in on itself, a skeletal frame of burning timber against the black sky. casting dancing, demonic shadows that helped to hide him as he closed in on the horses. Two of the gang members were down, but he knew there was at least one more moving through the darkness, hunting him. As he rounded the corner of the storage shed, he saw them. Maggie was trying to force Bertie onto a horse, but the young woman was fighting back with a surprising, ferocious strength. She was clawing at Maggie's face, her fingers like talons, and twisting her body to avoid being thrown into the saddle. In the flickering firelight, Royce could see blood on both of them, some from the struggle, some from the small, deliberate cuts Bertie had given herself with the sewing needle earlier. It had been a signal, he realized, a desperate, silent plea for help. "Federal Marshal," Royce's voice boomed, cutting through the storm. He stepped out from the shadows, his Colt Peacemaker leveled directly at Maggie's chest. "Let her go. Step away from the horses. It's over." Maggie spun around, her face a twisted mask of rage and desperation. Her carefully constructed world was literally burning down around her. "You have no idea what you've done, you fool!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This operation feeds a dozen families across 3 territories. You've ruined everything." But it was Bertie who spoke next, and her voice shocked Royce to his core. It cut through the night with an unexpected and chilling authority. "She's lying, Marshal," Bertie said. "This isn't about families. It's about greed, pure and simple." Something in her tone, the sudden steel in her voice, made Royce look at her more carefully. The nervous, fumbling, terrified girl from the parlor was gone. In her place stood a woman with cold fury in her eyes and an unwavering confidence in her stance. She was no longer trembling. She was no longer acting helpless. She pushed Maggie away from her with a strength that belied her small frame. "My name," she continued, her voice ringing with power as she reached inside the collar of her simple dress, "is Ruth Caldwell." She pulled out a small, flat object. It caught the firelight and gleamed. A badge identical to Royce's own. Deputy U.S. Marshal, working undercover for the past 2 months. The revelation hit Royce like a lightning strike. It was a twist he could never have seen coming. There was no sister being held hostage. There was no coercion. Bertie, or rather Deputy Marshal Ruth Caldwell, had been playing a role. She had infiltrated this murderous gang, gathering evidence from the inside, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nervous behavior, the fumbling with the needle, the terrified glances, all of it had been a masterful performance, an act designed to keep her alive and maintain her cover. Maggie's face went white with shock and disbelief as she realized the timid little mouse she'd been tormenting was a federal agent. You little witch," she snarled, her hand diving for a small pistol hidden in the folds of her apron. But Ruth was faster, much faster. Her hand was already moving, pulling a small derringer from a hidden holster on her ankle. A single shot cracked through the night. The bullet took Maggie in the shoulder, spinning the older woman around and sending her pistol flying into the mud. At that exact same moment, Royce heard a sound behind him, the click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. He spun around to find the last gang member, the gravelly-voiced man from upstairs, emerging from the smoke, his rifle leveled at Royce's back. Before Royce could even bring his own gun to bear, another shot rang out. The gang member grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and then pitched forward into the mud. Ruth's second bullet from a second derringer had found its mark. The entire operation, a reign of terror that had claimed the lives of dozens of innocent travelers, was finally over. Ended in a storm of fire and rain by 2 U.S. Marshals who had, until tonight, never even met. As the flames began to die down and the storm slowly began to clear, Royce and Ruth stood among the smoking ashes of what was once Magnolia's Rest. The physical evidence they had hoped to find was gone, consumed by the fire Royce had started. But they had something better. They had a survivor, an inside source, and the ringleader herself. Together, their testimony would be enough to connect this operation to similar crimes across the territory, bringing justice to the families of victims who had never known what happened to their loved ones. "I never wanted anyone else to walk into this trap," Ruth said, her voice quiet now, the adrenaline fading. She looked at the destruction around them, her face streaked with soot and rain. "Every single night, I had to sit there and watch them plan for the next victim. Listen to them laugh about the people they'd killed, knowing I couldn't blow my cover until I had enough evidence to stop all of them. For good. Royce understood the terrible weight she had been carrying. He nodded, the respect he felt for her immense. You saved my life tonight, Deputy. If you hadn't been here, you would have figured it out, she replied, a slight weary smile touching her lips. Marshals have a way of surviving the impossible. It's part of the job description. The remaining horses were loaded with saddlebags full of stolen goods. Money, jewelry, watches, and other personal effects that could finally be returned to the grieving families. Maggie, wounded but very much alive, was tied securely to one of the saddles. She would stand trial for her crimes, and she would talk. They always did. As the first light of dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, two federal marshals rode toward town, their prisoner in tow, the evidence of a nightmare finally brought to an end. What had started for Royce as a simple search for shelter from a storm had become the final chapter in a reign of terror that stretched across hundreds of miles. In the end, he had gotten what he wanted, a place to rest for the night. He just hadn't expected that rest to come after the most dangerous and most successful night of his entire career. The trail to Copper Ridge would have to wait. There was more work to be done, reports to file, and a vast criminal network to dismantle. But for now, as they rode on, the road ahead looked a little brighter, the world a little safer, knowing there were others like Ruth Caldwell out there, fighting the same good fight. If you enjoyed this tale of justice on the American frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And if you really want to support the channel, consider leaving a comment below. Let me know what you think really happened to Mrs. Henderson. Your support helps us bring these forgotten tales of courage and survival to light. Now click on the next video to discover another gripping story you won't want to miss.